The hard part of this progression isn't actually the technical aspects. Most people that are on this live session that are listening are professionals, and you probably already know how to make budgets or forecasts, and you definitely know how to manage the bookkeeping process. And so technical skills are not really an issue on the progression. It's usually more of a mind shift that we see as being the real hurdle to becoming a true fractional controller or outsourced controller. And to us, or at least to me, the real problem is that professionals, I myself am one, in accounting are continually trained to look at past data, provide hard quantifiable deliverables. And when you look again at what the definition of a controller is, controllers are supposed to be more future focused and more managerial in nature. And those two things really are juxtaposed. They don't really go well together. And so to become that controller, you really do need to become into that more management mindset. You really need to understand what's truly valuable to your client. And that is much more subjective, and it's much more intangible than what we are typically trained for. And that's really what the core problem is, in my opinion, in terms of progressing to outsourced controllership. And so when it comes to understanding, knowing what is truly valuable to your clients, there's two things that I like to talk about and two things that we see with professionals that are kind of holding them back. It's more mindset issues than anything else. So the first mindset issue that I want to discuss before we get into the steps in detail on how to progress to outsourced controllership is static deliverables. What is a static deliverable? In the most simple terms, a static deliverable is a process or a service offering that is being carried out simply to satisfy a client request. It's just checking off a box. And so a quick example, near and dear to my heart at least, is a simple cash flow forecast. You can create a simplified cash flow forecast from the last 12 months of accounting data and provide this as a spreadsheet to a client for review. The process itself is pretty straightforward to carry out. I'm not saying it's quick or easy, but it's straightforward to do. And in a general sense, it satisfies a client need. If they're looking for a forecast, you simply go into your accounting system, pull the data, create it, produce it, and you're done. And so it's really easy for us as professionals to think exactly that. It's really easy to consider that job done upon delivery of that forecast. But that's what I like to call a static deliverable trap. And the reason for that is because the real question we should be asking ourselves is, what did the client actually want from the cash flow forecast? You know, maybe they wanted some advice around how their business should be proceeding in the future. Perhaps they wanted some suggestions on cost savings on an ongoing basis. Or maybe they wanted to know what different scenarios might look like. Maybe they've got a new revenue line or a new division coming out that they needed help with. And if we as professionals haven't answered that core need, you know, those questions that the client is asking, we haven't actually delivered anything of value. Even though we've given them a forecast that we spent time and effort on, we haven't actually done a true job. The job actually isn't done because from the client's perspective, their needs haven't been satisfied. And that's why we like to call it a static deliverable trap. Because even though we've given something, it doesn't mean that from the client's perspective, the full deliverable was actually received. And so to avoid static deliverables and the static deliverable trap, as we like to call it, you really need to do two things, in my opinion. You need to take a really big step back and appreciate precisely what your clients are facing every day. You need to know what is going on in their business and what's changing. And you need to know what's truly useful information for them, things that will actually help drive their business, whether it's operationally future looking, whatever that might be. And secondly, you need to remember to spend your time on what matters. You can spend a lot of time on modeling and forecasting and making things perfect, or you could take that time and spend it collaborating with your clients, getting to know them better and truly figuring out their needs. And of course, in my opinion, that latter is much more valuable to your client because it builds the relationship and it shows that you truly care. But it allows you to actually provide better advice because it gives you more information to help them actually run their business. And that's true value to a client. So to progress into a controller role, you really need to be providing the opposite of static deliverables. You need to be providing dynamic, collaborative, iterative processes with your client, one where the owner's continually involved and providing feedback and necessary information to you so that you can properly carry out your job. So going back to that simplified cash flow forecast, actually building a forecast that really delivers on the end need of it, the end desire of that client. And for here, it's really useful to remember the typical decision-making process. There's usually 6 steps in decision-making. 1, identify the actual problem. 2, gather information on the problem. 3, figure out potential solutions or alternatives for the problem. Actually then step 4, assess those alternatives and different solutions. And then step 5 would be make a choice on those alternatives. And then the final step would be actually taking action. So if you and your client can quickly and efficiently do all 6 of those steps in the decision-making process within your service offering, within the functions that you're providing, then you're providing dynamic services. You're not providing a static deliverable. You're literally helping the client walk through a decision-making process, and your solutions are now geared to answering the questions and the problems that are coming up in those actual decision-making processes. And if you can do that, your services are going to be light years ahead of your peers, in my opinion. And your clients will be forever grateful for it, because what we commonly see, and even in my own experience when I first started out my own firm, it was really easy to provide static deliverables. It's having those long task lists, checklists. They're great for kind of keeping jobs to be done and managing your projects, but it's also very easy to just check off a task and consider it done. And so it's really nuanced, but really focusing on the purpose of that task. It's not just a checkbox you need to check off. There's something behind it. The client literally needs something out of it. They want something out of it. What is that? Really need to keep that in mind. So let's shift to the second mindset issue we see. This one I call reactive deliverables. And reactive deliverables are, of course, very similar to static deliverables, but they are different. And what I mean by that is you could be correctly collaborating and interacting with your clients. You could be providing a dynamic deliverable, a dynamic service, but it could still be reactive. And by that, I mean, it could still require far too much client input for it to be properly carried out to completion, for you to be able to carry it out to completion without it. And I always love to use bill payment services as an example here, where you and your team are handling your client's accounts payable. Now, it's not to say that you have to do this in order to be proactive and dynamic in everything that we're talking about. This is just an example. But if you're doing the accounts payables process for your client all the way to actual payment processing, this could be a fully interactive and collaborative process. But if you're still asking questions of your client, like, when would you like to pay this bill? You're actually not offering a proactive service. You're actually offering a reactive process. Putting it another way, you can't fully own and manage this particular function, in this case a bill pay service, because your client just still needs to put in too much time and effort of their own in the decision-making process in order for you to actually complete it all the way. And so it's still very much reactive. It's heavily reliant on the client to provide that input. And so to eliminate reactive deliverables, you really need solid systems and processes in place, as well as, again, an in-depth understanding of your client's business. Again, looking at the bill payment example, you need to advance your knowledge of the client to a point where you can provide suggestions to them. So if you can sit there and go to your client and you know which vendors are a priority, what are the terms of each vendor, who's the squeaky wheel that's continually bugging them. If you have that information, you can make more decisions on behalf of your client. You can do it for them. And then that means your client has less to think about and less to do in the process. And therefore the process itself is then less reactive. It's much more proactive. Of course, gaining this level of knowledge requires 2 things. It requires a lot of time, and you need to take a lot of time to understand the business, learning its processes, its key customers, its key vendors, key pain points, all of that fun stuff. But not only that, you actually need to also take a lot of time to get to know the business owner themselves. And while the business has its own nuances and key pain points, you're also talking to a human, the small business owner here, that has their own complexities that can be different from the company itself. And you need to know what's important to them at a personal level in order to provide advice that genuinely resonates with them. So you need to be spending a lot of time getting to know the business and the business owner itself. And this can be done over 2 different timeframes. It can be done over the very short term, or it can be done over the long term. And in the short term, I mean, maybe you've got an onboarding process or a half-day or day-long session with your client or questionnaires. But it's really good to spend some time getting to know your client and their clients' business right out of the gates. So giving them questionnaires, doing process mapping, reviewing their business plans, anything you can do right away to learn as much as is possible about your client is extremely useful. And then over the long term, you can gain more information about your client and their business over time, really gaining an understanding of the inner workings as a business and as a person at a deeper level. But in either case, we're talking about time here. So I really want to point out, and we talk about this a lot in terms of any live session, really value your time, because if you try to compete too much in terms of price on your services, you simply won't have enough margin to have the time to actually then understand your client and ultimately provide the service, the advisory service that you need to for your client. So we speak about it a lot. Make sure you really value your time so that you can properly understand and build relationships and all of that fun stuff. And of course, in saying that, it's really easy to say, charge more. That's kind of the answer to everybody's problems these days. But it's really good to remind ourselves the value proposition from the client. In this case, we talked about value propositions even on the last cash flow live sessions, because it's easier for us to forget the value proposition and think that there isn't a lot of value. But if you remember that what we're calling reactive services versus proactive services in terms of bookkeeping and accounting are exactly the same from our perspective, there's only one difference between them, and that's taking that one final step further where we provide our own advice, insight, and knowledge to the actual end output. And this is gleaned from our own experience and knowledge of the business. That's the only key difference between reactive and proactive services. It's a small step, but that single additional step from the client's perspective provides a huge amount of incremental value. If you want to step back and look at things from a 10,000-foot view, the client gets with reactive services an offering where they're continually hounded to dig up receipts, explain spending patterns, decide vendor priority, payment priorities, this, that, the other. Or they could have a proactive service offering where you are using your knowledge and insights to take away a lot of that pain. And the client then gets an offering where they're rarely hounded and they're simply asked for final approval on a well laid out plan. And the only key difference between those two is our input. One has it and one doesn't. Reactive being the one that doesn't, and proactive obviously the one that does. And every business person I know is insanely busy. And so there's no real question about which service offering has more value. The proactive services, in my opinion, win by a landslide because they take so much pressure off the actual business owner. And it's not just pressure, it's also they're gaining insight and advice and expertise in an area that they probably don't have expertise in. And so looking at the value proposition, could you charge an extra 10 grand a month for this? No, probably not unless it's a really big client and a really big company. But could you charge an extra $200 a month, $500, $1,000 per month? Those numbers are not a stretch at all for proactive services because of the pain that you're taking away from the client. But again, keep in mind, the real point here is that you're not actually adding a ton of time and effort on your own side. You're simply taking the expertise out of your brain and adding it onto the process. And that's what adds the real value to the whole process for the client. So don't shortchange yourself. Really try to get away from valuing the time and value your expertise, because if you can do that, that gives you more time and capacity because you've got greater margins. You can actually spend the time that you need to understanding, again, your client, their actual personality, and you can gauge your service offerings appropriately. So those are the two mindset issues that we see a lot. So hopefully after having walked through what we call static deliverables and reactive deliverables, you can see that really the key issue here is perception and framing things properly from the eyes of the client more than anything else. And if you can make the mental mindset shift and frame things up appropriately, you can quickly make the transition from a bookkeeper to an outsourced controller. Again, the technical skills are there, and if they're not, they can be quickly learned or easily picked up. The tricky part is that mindset shift more than anything else.